Welcome back, everyone, as we dive into the second half of Historia Civilis' look at the July Revolution in France, and more broadly covering the time of 1820 to the July Revolution in 1830. So we've covered the first half. I'll put a link down in the description so you can see my reaction to the first half if you haven't already seen it. And I just want to address one of the most common things we've been talking about in the comment section of that video, and that is many of you have observed, and I observed this yesterday as well. I don't think I really pointed it out too much, though, that it seems like the creator of Historia Civilis did insert a lot more of his own bias, his own opinions in how he presented this, and I think that may be coloring some of it. And there's not necessarily anything inherently wrong with that, because as I often say, we all have biases. The important thing is that, number one, we recognize our own biases, and we do our best to mitigate that when we're presenting history. But it's also important for us then who are studying history or who are learning history from a video like this or from any book or any historian, a lecturer, a professor, anything, that we consider the bias of the source, of the person who's presenting, and how we then interpret what we're being told. So considering then that there seems to be at least some bias in a particular slant when it comes to how this is presented, just keep that in mind as you watch this. And where you feel appropriate, push back in watching, in your mind, in the comment section. Do the same with me. I have biases. I have worldviews that may be different than yours. And so occasionally I'm going to say things that you may disagree with. That's what the comment section's for. It's a great place for us to do that, to have those discussions and together learn and grow in our understanding of history. So let's go ahead and dive into part two.
The French army landed in Algeria in early June, and 10 days later they won their first significant victory, all according to plan. On the day that the news of the French victory reached Paris, the king decided to make a big public spectacle of attending mass, to beef up his religious credibility on the eve of the election. As expected, large crowds gathered to catch a glimpse of the king as he made his way through the streets. But there was no cheering, no waving. The crowds just stood there, eerily silent, watching the king like a pack of hungry wolves.
Yeah, well, like I said, I'm going to try to push back a little more in this one. Do we really know what the motivations were for the crowd? Like, what are they thinking? What are they wondering? Or are they just watching to see what happens? I don't know.
Voting began shortly after this, and then wrapped up in the third week of July. The feeling going into the election was that it might be close. It wasn't close. 65% of the legislative seats went to the Liberal and Republican opposition. 32% of the seats went to the king's ultra-conservatives.
Not good for the king.
Went to smaller groups that also opposed Polignac's government. A massive victory for the Liberals. The king and his ultra-conservative allies met to decide what to do about the election results.
And what should you do? I mean, hindsight tells us back down, work with them. You've doubled down, it hasn't been working. Maybe it's time to try something different. But hindsight's 20/20.
Discussion centered around Article 14 of the Charter. If they argued that the liberals in the legislature were a semi-treasonous faction, then the king had the authority under Article 14 of the Charter to make the necessary laws for the security of the state. After much debate, the king decided to invoke Article 14 and use it to do four things. These would later become known as the Four Ordinances. 1. Dissolve the newly elected Liberal majority legislature. 2. Reform the French electoral system and make it pretty much impossible for the Liberals to ever win again.
I don't like the election results, so we're going to change it so that never happens again. What could go wrong?
3. Immediately hold new elections under this new electoral system and allow the ultra-conservatives to win pretty much every seat. 4. Suspend freedom of the press and shut down the liberal newspapers.
Now, I will say this. Suspending the freedom of the press is a pretty common thing that is happening in this time in history and in Europe. It's not unique to France. Napoleon did it, speaking of France, but the British did it and others have done it at that time. So these things are not necessarily unusual. The problem is they're coming on the tails of a decade of growing discontent with the monarchy, a monarchy that had been replaced several times already in the last couple of decades. And this is just further evidence that King Charles at this point isn't reading which way the wind is blowing. And, something similar is going to happen, 80 years later in the Russian Empire, where you're going to have Tsar Nicholas II just not reading the room at all. And if he had been willing to compromise, if he had been willing to truly allow the Russian Duma to have real power and the people to have a voice in that power, he might have held on to his throne. It wouldn't have looked like it did. He wouldn't have been in absolute power. Same thing with Charles here. Is it better to not be on the throne at all, or be on the throne but maybe not have the power you did before?
Who the king blamed for his drop in popularity and the unexpected election results. That's right, it was the newspaper's fault, not the 10 years of unpopular policies. The king's cousin, Louis-Philippe, was not informed that the king was taking this step. He learned of the 4 ordinances by reading about it in the newspaper.
And a little further discussion on this idea of all these kings with the name Louis. You had King Louis XVI, Louis XVIII are brothers. They had another brother who also had the first name Louis. Louis-Philippe is he's going to be the next king, and he's going to have the name Louis as well. Louis was the name that you gave to royal. It was like the first name of a lot of these guys. Most of them went by their other names. This is common in a lot of places. In Germans at this time, in 1700s, you'll see a lot of German immigrants to the United States, and they all have the first name Johann. But there'll be Johann Peter and Johann Michael and Johann Paul, and they'll just go by the middle name rather than the first name, but they all had the first name Johann. And it was very common then for women to have Maria for a first name, but go by the middle names.
Louis-Philippe was more friendly to the liberals than his cousin the king was, and when he read what the king had done, he told his wife, "They've done it. They've mounted a coup d'etat." Later that day, he hosted a large group of mostly liberal supporters at his home, and quite
Notice this. You've got the heir to the throne, the potential next in line, meeting with the right people, meeting with the other side, the ones that King Charles won't give the time of day to.
Naturally, the king's 4 ordinances were all anybody could talk about. In front of all these people, the usually careful Louis-Philippe lost his composure and shouted, "They're mad! They'll get themselves exiled again!"
I don't know if this is so much him losing his composure as him understanding the situation.
His liberal supporters urged him to come to Paris and throw his support behind the liberal opposition. Louis-Philippe told them no. He wouldn't openly go against the king. For the time being, he would do nothing.
Right. You can't be seen to be the one leading the charge to overthrow the king, because you want that title of being king. And so you can't undermine the very monarchy you want to take over. You need other people to do that for you.
In Paris, the liberal newspapers were not taking this lying down. One paper famously wrote, "The legal regime is now interrupted. That of force has begun. In this situation, obedience ceases to be a duty." Later continuing, "France must judge how far it ought to take its resistance." They were coming just a hair shy of openly calling for revolution. That evening, soldiers tried to shut down one of the many liberal newspapers that were continuing to operate in violation of the king's new censorship law.
So now this is where you're going to take these ordinances and you're going to see how they play out in real life. You're going to try to shut down these newspapers. Is this going to be allowed, or are the people going to fight back?
This attracted a crowd who began taunting the soldiers with cries of "Down with the Bourbons" and "Long live the Charter." The soldiers tried to suppress the crowd, but it quickly turned into a riot, with mobs roaming the streets and smashing street lamps. By pure chance, one of these mobs stumbled across Prime Minister Polignac and his Minister of the Navy as they were leaving a cabinet meeting. The mob closed in and started pelting the two with rocks. The politicians narrowly escaped the mob by jumping into a nearby carriage, but not before the Minister of the Navy was badly injured. Somehow, the French Navy managed to lose a battle on the streets of Paris. They really weren't safe anywhere. On July 27th, thousands of soldiers were sent to shut down the liberal opposition newspapers, which led to widespread protests across Paris. First, the soldiers tried to escalate things by charging one of the crowds on horseback, which didn't work. Later, they tried to escalate further by firing indiscriminately into the crowd. 21 were killed and scores were wounded. As the sun went down on a violent day, some new revolutionary slogans were heard in the protests. Down with the aristocrats! Death to the ministers! Only 24 hours ago, these had been liberal crowds who had been protesting for constitutionalism. And
this is what happens when you escalate things. You cause the other side to escalate things, and you take people who maybe were reasonable and on the fence and at least willing to negotiate, and you turn them into radicals.
Free press. Now they were revolutionary crowds, and they wanted to overthrow the government. The violence had only radicalized the people. The next day, the crowds were significantly larger. The man in charge of defending Paris at this time was Major General Marmont, and he had a hell of a problem on his hands. His garrison in Paris had been hollowed out for the Algerian campaign.
And yeah, I do believe this is the same Marmont who was one of Napoleon's marshals.
Of those that remained, most of the higher-ranking officers had been sent home so that they could vote for the ultra-conservatives in the upcoming election. Marmont's garrison was not in any way prepared for what they were about to encounter. At noon, Marmont moved into Paris with the aim of occupying key bridges and public squares, where the protests had been the strongest. What they found when they entered the city was totally unexpected. Within the last 24 hours, veterans of the Napoleonic Wars had grabbed their dusty old muskets and gone over to help the protesters. The veterans had each adopted large groups of protesters, and in only a day, they taught them a few tricks. As Marmont's soldiers advanced through the streets, they ran into thousands, yes, thousands, of barricades.
Beyond the barricade, is there a world you long to see? So join in the fight that will give you the right to be free. So this is not the rebellion that is portrayed in Les Miserables, but they did use barricades, and that rebellion is actually going to be 2 years later. It's in June of 1832, so a lot of the same strategies involved, just on a much smaller scale.
These were tall defensive structures, built out of ripped up cobblestones and furniture and wagons and parts of buildings, and anything else that the protesters could get their hands on. The taller ones could be 3 meters high, which for the Americans in the audience is approximately learn how long a meter is high. Quite high.
10 feet.
The old veterans instructed the protesters not only to build the barricades, but also to occupy the buildings on each side of the streets approaching the barricades, so that any enemy soldiers would be hit with musket fire from 3 directions. They also loaded up the buildings with cobblestones and roof tiles and other things that unarmed protesters could hurl down at the soldiers. Let's not be cute. By other things, I mean human excrement.
Yep. That's exactly what I figured he meant.
As groups of soldiers advanced into the city, they bumped into barricades that hadn't been there last night. When they turned around, they bumped into new barricades that hadn't been there a few hours earlier. It was like being trapped in a maze, but the walls kept shifting, and also somebody kept dumping human excrement into it. Marmont had not thought to send his soldiers into the city with supplies, and so the whole garrison spent 8 or more hours covered in filth, frantically marching in circles with no food or water.
This is the same Marmont who fought in Spain and dealt with a lot of these same kinds of issues dealing with insurrections in Spain, so you'd think he'd be a little better equipped to deal with it.
Was at an all-time low. A great many soldiers either surrendered to the protesters or defected to join their cause. As the sun began to set, Many of the soldiers had to make direct assaults on the barricades just to escape the city and make it back to camp. Late in the day, the liberal opposition opened negotiations with Marmont. They told him that as a precondition to any talks, the king must revoke the 4 ordinances. Marmont expressed his sympathy and agreed to take their demand directly to Prime Minister Polignac.
And once again, you're going to have the king with an opportunity to back down, to negotiate, to come to a solution that does not involve him losing his crown.
The Prime Minister flatly rejected this preliminary demand and told Marmont that there would not be any further meetings with the delegates.
How can you possibly repeatedly get it so wrong?
Marmont was stunned at his response and decided to take the highly unorthodox step of writing to the king personally.
Good for him.
He wrote, "This is no longer a riot. It is a revolution." Continuing, "I think it is urgent that your majesty profit without delay from the overtures that are made to him."
So I think what he's seeing here is that right now the prime minister is just in the way. And he's probably thinking the king probably isn't even aware how bad this situation is, because the prime minister is probably not telling him how bad the situation is. So somebody needs to tell him. He's probably thinking, okay, if the king really understands the situation, he will come to a different response.
The honor of the crown can still be saved.
Yeah, listen
Tomorrow,
to him.
Perhaps it will be too late. I am taking measures to pacify the revolt. The troops will be ready at noon, but I await with impatience your majesty's orders. To be clear, this was way out of line. This was a local military officer going around the prime minister so that he could advise the king on political matters.
But he's doing what's in the king's best interest at this point.
But Marmont was desperate, and nobody.
And he's not a local military officer. This is one of Napoleon's marshals. This is a guy who is one of the most prominent generals left in the French military.
Him seemed to be taking the situation seriously. The king wrote back and basically told Marmont to hold steady. Marmont's pleas had fallen on deaf ears.
Yeah, sorry, Charles. You deserve to lose your crown at this point.
The next morning, Marmont pulled back to a defensive position. He wouldn't be tricked into another costly engagement like yesterday. Almost immediately, 15 or 20% of Marmont's 12,000 soldiers defected and went over to join the protesters.
I was just sitting here thinking to myself, how would it feel to be one of these soldiers who's being ordered to fire upon civilians that you might actually agree with?
In order to fill the holes in his defensive position, Marmont ordered his men to pull back into an even tighter circle, which the soldiers incorrectly interpreted as a retreat, which triggered a chain reaction of even more defections. By noon, the defections were totally out of control, and in order to stem the losses, the king fired Marmont and ordered the garrison to withdraw from the city, turning a false retreat into a real one. The protesters had captured Paris. The whole thing only took 3 days.
How could you be so stupid over and over again?
Old man Talleyrand, who had lost faith in the king and had been...
Talleyrand only has faith in Talleyrand. This is a guy who, there have been few political opportunists in world history like Talleyrand. This guy is always flipping to whatever side is going to give him the best opportunity moving forward.
Helping to guide the liberal opposition from behind the scenes, was perhaps the first person to fully understand the significance of this. As he and his political allies watched the soldiers leaving the city, he took out his pocket watch and declared, 29th of July, 5 minutes past midday. The elder branch of the House of Bourbon has ceased to reign.
Go find Louis-Philippe.
Liberal opposition was blown away at their own success. They had been fighting to overturn the 4 ordinances and squeeze some political concessions out of the king. And now, without even really intending to do so, they had overthrown the monarchy. That evening, the king finally tried to negotiate. If he had done that yesterday when Marmont asked him to, it may have helped. But now it was too late. The liberal...
It's so funny because this is such a part of human nature. I've been watching, this has nothing to do with history, but my son has really gotten me into watching police body cam footage. And it's amazing to me, especially when it comes to drunk people, but also a lot of very immature people. They'll fight and fight and fight, and they'll resist, and they'll fight back against the police. And it's only after they're in handcuffs and in the back of a police car that then they are suddenly willing to do the things the police told them to do in the first place that would have prevented them from getting arrested. It's human nature to go too far, and only when you've gone too far to realize, oh, I should have agreed to that way back here. When it's too late.
Controlled Paris, and they got to decide what happened next. The next day, the Liberals and their Republican allies were locked in a heated internal debate. Some argued for using their new position to overthrow the entire system, while others urged caution. The other great powers were monitoring the situation in France carefully, and if they caught even a whiff of something resembling the French Revolution, most of them were prepared to march into France to stop it.
That's what they've done other times, right? Most of these wars of the coalition, first against the French Revolution and then against Napoleon, were started by the coalitions, not by France. And it was to contain France. It was to restore the monarchy before things got out of control.
That's how you get a world war. As if to drive this point home, as the liberal opposition gathered to debate their next move, they could hear cries of "Long live Napoleon" coming from the streets. The people were in a dangerous mood.
So at this point, Napoleon Bonaparte he's been dead for 9 years. He wouldn't have been, I mean, he would have been 60 at this point if he had lived. And if he hadn't been sent to St. Helena, he probably would be still alive. Though it was cancer that killed him, but you never know what might have happened otherwise. But Napoleon's got lots of family left. He's got brothers, he's got nephews. And it's another couple of decades after this that his nephew is going to become first president and then later Emperor Napoleon III.
He seemed fully prepared to do the whole French Revolution over again. Although it must be said that the crowd was a little misguided in their sloganeering. Napoleon was dead. He wasn't long living nothing.
And that wasn't the point, though. And I do, again, as I mentioned earlier, I like his videos better when he doesn't insert so much of his opinion in it. Just give us the history, I mean, we're all biased, I get that. But you don't have to be so overtly opinionated about it, I guess.
Liberals finally figured out what their demands would be. They demanded that King Charles be removed from power and that France transition to a limited constitutional monarchy, kind of modeled after Great Britain. This, they believed, would be just radical enough to satisfy the Republicans and prevent a civil war, but not so radical that it would freak out the other great powers and trigger a world war. The problem was figuring out who to replace the king with. Some of the more radical Republicans suggested Napoleon's 19-year-old son, but that idea was dismissed out of hand.
That's right, he was still alive at this point, so he's often known as the King of Rome, Roi de Rome, but he will die soon after this. I think he dies in like 31, 32, something like that. He's only like 20. Like I said, there are other family members. Napoleon does have other sons, but they're illegitimate.
Remember, they were trying to not freak out the other great powers. Others suggested the king's 9-year-old grandson, Henry, or Henri, I guess. But the mainstream liberals rejected this over fears that the tyrant King Charles would continue to wield power from behind the scenes. They settled on the one person that they could all agree on, the king's 56-year-old cousin, Louis-Philippe. The liberal politicians, by far the largest part of the coalition of...
Remember, Louis-Philippe has already made kind of behind-the-scenes overtures to this group, so he's in their mind. They know he's somebody they can work with. He's not an unknown quantity.
Opposition groups strongly favored Louis-Philippe, as it was widely known that he was a closet liberal.
Yep.
The more conservative members of the group felt that they could hold their noses and back Louis-Philippe, since they could rest easy knowing that the monarchy would survive. The radical Republicans, who were initially pushing for Napoleon's son, also felt that they could hold their noses and get behind Louis-Philippe. What made Louis-Philippe unique was that he had fought with distinction in the Republican army. That was a big deal to the veterans of the Napoleonic Wars. He may have been royalty, but in a way he was one of them. It was also noteworthy to the veterans that even after circumstances forced him to flee France, Louis-Philippe never took up arms against his own country. Many exiled aristocrats did, but Louis-Philippe always refused. That was a big deal. So it seemed that Louis-Philippe was the only candidate for king that could unite the liberal, conservative, and Republican factions and prevent a civil war, at least for now. By the evening of July 30th, Louis-Philippe was on his way to Paris. It wasn't official yet, but the reign of King Charles X was effectively over. When Louis-Philippe entered Paris, he was greeted with cries of "Long live the Republic!" This was a bit of a problem. The people of Paris had been radicalized by the violence of the last 5 days.
Yeah, so now he's coming into this situation, and while he set himself up well by kind of cozying up to these factions, he's still got to come in and calm the situation down because, like I said, it's in the nature of the French people for generations at this point to fight, to rebel. And once they get their blood up, it's hard to bring it back down. So Louis-Philippe's going to have his hands full.
Yes, it had only been 5 days, and they might not be okay with the monarchy surviving at all. Louis-Philippe had to perform a difficult balancing act. He made an effort to reach out to all of Napoleon's old generals, and made sure to appear with them publicly, alongside symbols of the revolution, like the tricolor flag. He had to somehow communicate, "I am basically on your side," while also making it clear that he was not reestablishing the Republic. His outreach worked. The people of Paris rallied behind Louis-Philippe, and a couple of days later, Charles X abdicated the throne. The July Revolution was complete. In 1830, France got off lucky. There should have been a civil war, but there wasn't. There should have been an invasion by France's conservative neighbors, but there wasn't.
Wouldn't say there should have been, but there could have been if things didn't go the way that they did.
The liberals and their new king, Louis-Philippe, somehow managed to thread the needle and preserve the peace. Austria...
Honestly, it goes to show you how weary still these people were of all the wars and all the revolutions that have gone on in France. And, there couldn't have been a family that was untouched by death in some shape or form from the previous generation. But, they just needed somebody that was willing to be reasonable. And if Charles X had shown any reason whatsoever, any willingness to compromise, it could have all been avoided.
Austria was quick to recognize the new government in France. Metternich had been busy behind the scenes, reassuring the great powers that Louis-Philippe would be a perfectly acceptable king. And
Metternich, remember, he's the kind of the main guy pulling the strings as far as diplomacy goes for the Austrian Empire. Formerly, the Austrian emperor was also the last emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, which is now gone. And so Metternich is kind of the leading guy in the Congress of Vienna, which is just, 15 years before this. He's now kind of toward the end of his influence in Europe.
And with him in charge, they had no reason to worry about the July Revolution spinning out of control. He was right. On August 3rd, Louis-Philippe reopened the legislature and proposed a set of liberal reforms, including eliminating the loophole in Article 14 of the Charter that allowed the king to seize power in the name of security. All of these reforms were popular and they passed easily. The old charter had stated that the king was the sole source of sovereignty. Now, sovereignty was shared between the king and the legislature. Politicians could now write their own legislation without first getting the approval of the king. Ministers were still approved by the king, but now they could be removed by the legislature. The old censorship law was scrapped. The size of the electorate was increased by 75%. It wasn't what Republicans would have asked for. The only people allowed to vote were still a small, wealthy minority. But it was
And this is not unique to France. I mean, wealthy landowners that's been the norm in many of these countries. And as you're getting into the 1830s and then the 1840s with all the revolutions that happened in 1848, even across the ocean in the United States, you're seeing reform in terms of who can vote. You're not going quite to women yet in minorities in some countries, but the vast majority, for example, in the United States, of white men are going to be able to vote by the time you get to the middle of the 19th century. It doesn't matter if you own land or not.
Step in the right direction.
I think the UK does something similar.
1830 was a turning point for Europe. The liberals pulled off a relatively bloodless revolution in France, but it was also part of a wider trend in Europe of liberals finally rising up against the authoritarian status quo. Portugal, Spain, Belgium, Switzerland, Northern Italy, the German Confederation, and Poland all saw liberal uprisings of some kind.
And what do they all have in common? These are all places that Napoleon had not only conquered or acquired in these wars of the coalitions, but had also started instituting his Napoleonic Code, his reforms, which probably empowered a lot of these people to feel like they could have more.
Some were successful, some were not, but the larger point is that the post-war conservative order was crumbling, and a new period of liberal ascendancy was beginning. The liberal victories brought about a profound change in the political left in Europe. Before 1830, the moderate liberals and the radical republicans were united in their opposition to the conservatives in power. As the liberals came to power in France and elsewhere, it exposed rifts in their coalition.
When you're fighting for something, you're united. We say this all the time. As soon as you achieve that thing, that's when the cracks form, and that's when the infighting starts. And that's when it becomes harder to hold together your new system.
In the words of Eric Hobsbawm, after 1830, liberalism and democracy appeared to be adversaries rather than allies. Alexis de Tocqueville was a big-time defender of liberal France in the 1830s and viewed the Republican left with a lot of suspicion. He wrote of the split, quote, "From the 18th century there flows two rivers. One carries men to free institutions, the other to absolute power. Liberalism, in his view, brought with it free institutions. Republicanism, in his view, brought with it mob rule and chaos, which naturally led, in his view, to absolute power and emperors." Not only did 1830 split the liberals and the Republicans, but it also split the East and the West. Liberalism triumphed over authoritarianism in France, Britain, and Belgium, which meant that Western Europe became a sort of liberal bloc. Portugal and Spain were doing their own thing, but they were so weak and consumed with internal conflict that they couldn't challenge their liberal neighbors. Eastern Europe had mostly suppressed their liberal revolts,
For now.
making them a kind of conservative bloc.
I feel like he's setting this up that his next episode's going to be on the revolutions of 1848.
Where monarchies continued to dominate political life. The interesting thing about France in 1830 is that it provides a sobering example of what happens when conservative governments try to freeze out even incremental progress and liberal institutions. This all could have been avoided if, at any time during the preceding 10 years, France had just allowed the liberals to win an election. That's what elections are. They're release valves. If the liberals in France could have got into government and passed some reforms, it would have let off enough steam to avoid the July Revolution.
That's a great point. You have these conservatives, in this case, trying to hold back any influence for the liberals. If they'd allowed them some, it wouldn't have been nearly as much as what they ended up with. So by resisting allowing anything, they ended up allowing a lot more than otherwise might have happened.
But instead of doing that, the French ultra-conservatives in the 1820s sabotaged all of the release valves in order to suit their own short-term political aims.
It's a great way to describe it.
Demand for reform reached such intensity that the liberals were willing to do anything in order to achieve it. As a result, the king was overthrown, and the ultra-conservatives were swept out of power in France forever. The ultra-conservatives were so hell-bent on preventing any liberal reforms whatsoever that they lost everything. The same factors that produced the July Revolution in France were at work all across Europe. Some governments were overthrown, some were not, but every government had to figure out how to weather the same storm. No country did a better job at weathering the storm than Britain. Why?
Yeah.
Because unlike so many of their peer nations, Britain decided to allow their disputes to be resolved through...
Right, the monarchy and the government worked with the people who were unhappy with the situation and allowed the reforms to happen without getting to that place.
Politics. The election of 1830, which was coincidentally called on the same day that the French liberals captured Paris, unleashed the greatest period of legislative productivity in Britain in 100 years.
And 1830 is also a year in which the monarchy changes in Britain. You go from George IV, who had not only been king for 10 years, but had been Prince Regent before that, so had been in power for a while. And you go to his brother, William IV.
The British Liberals accomplished some great things, including something that up until now was thought to be impossible. Something that would change the world forever.
Slavery.
They abolished slavery in the British Empire.
All right, that was good. Definitely learned a lot there. I think it was a good look at a little talked about period in history, but one that has ramifications for the rest of the world. So let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.